A reading from the book of Genesis. God put Abraham to the test. He called to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son Isaac, your only one, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. There you shall offer him up as a holocaust on a height that I will point out to you." When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. Then he reached out and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the Lord's messenger called to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he answered. "Do not lay your hand on the boy," said the messenger. "Do not do the least thing to him. I know now how devoted you are to God, since you did not withhold from me your own beloved son." As Abraham looked about, he spied a ram caught by its horns in the thicket. So he went out and took the ram and offered it up as a holocaust in the place of his son. Again the Lord's messenger called to Abraham from heaven and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you acted as you did in not withholding from me your beloved son, I will bless you abundantly and make your descendants as countless as the stars of the sky and the sands of the seashore. Your descendants shall take possession of the gates of your enemies, and your descendants in all nations of the earth shall find blessing. All this because you obeyed my command." The word of the Lord.
And thanks be to God.
Why me? Of all the student brothers to preach tonight, why am I the one preaching on the sacrifice of my namesake? I even paused and I thought for a little bit. By all means, Michael Mary should be the one preaching tonight, because the last person from my class to preach was Paul, and Hill is the next alphabetical last name from El Hawaiic. And it's not that I just jumped in front of Michael Mary. I also jumped in front of Peter. Lewitsky is also before Miranda. Which confused me, and I thought maybe Brian's trying to pull a joke on me, which was my initial thought. And I actually talked to Brian about it, and he can corroborate that it is completely coincidental that I was the one to preach tonight on this. Yet, it's a little incredible to me that I get to preach on this reading, because the sacrifice of Isaac has always been something that interested me a lot. I mean, I was born with the middle name Isaac, baptized with the name, confirmed with the saint Isaac, son of Abraham, and as of recently took Isaac as a religious name. So he's been lingering around a lot in my life, and I've read this passage innumerable times. So it's quite a privilege for me to talk about the sacrifice of Isaac. But why me? I think about this question, and I think that it was inside the mind of Isaac himself. That when we read this passage, so often we hear of the fidelity of Abraham, and I may be a little biased, but I always think about what was going through Isaac's mind. That Isaac surely knew that he was the answer to his father's prayers. Isaac surely knew how valuable he was to his father, being his promised heir. And being raised in the same faith of his father, he knew how good and provident God was to his family. So why would God, even if it was a test, allow Abraham to follow through with sacrificing Isaac? Why me? And it's a cry that is genuine and acceptable. It's a cry of confusion that we don't just read in today's reading, but we feel it even today in people that we meet. That if we haven't experienced it already, we will encounter people who live in confusion. And often, and quite sadly, this confusion pulls them away from God. I think of the mothers of the victims of the recent school shooting, how they sit there and they wonder, why my child's life? Why my child's school? I think of young men and women out there who grew up in good and pious families, who want nothing more than to be the perfect Christian. Yet, deep down inside, before they can remember, they remember that they were attracted to someone of their own sex. And in their head, they think, why me? Why would God give me this cross? And frankly, as preachers and as people striving after the heart of Jesus, we will and we have encountered people and ourselves living in this confusion of how God can place these tragedies, these undesirable qualities, these circumstances in our lives. And I wish tonight I can sit here and tell you, here's the magic answer, but I don't think it's that simple. What I do know is that the solution that God sets forth for us is quite simple, but it's something that each of us has to choose on our own. And we can encourage many people to think about choosing the solution that God sets forth, but it's ultimately their decision, and that's to trust in His divine will. We see the fruits of it even in today's reading, that when Abraham follows through with what God asks him to do, God's response to him is, I swear by myself that because you acted as you did, in not withholding from me your beloved son, I will bless you abundantly. And we even look at Isaac, that though he isn't as front and center as his father or his son, he trusted in the Lord. And it's in that trust of the Lord that he was able to translate the faith and communicate the blessing of God to his son Jacob, who had eventually found the great nation of Israel, God's chosen people. And we see this time and time again, not only in Scripture, but in the centuries of men and women who've been pursuing the promises of God amidst great tragedies and deep wounds and the confusion that colors the human experience. Yet we have to pause and remember that God does not and will not fail us. As hard and as improbable as that may seem sometimes, God calls us to trust in that which is true, that He does not and will not fail us. So I leave you tonight with one final small story about my late grandmother. And the benefit of having a Mexican grandmother is I'll have a lifetime of wisdom that I can share with people. But my grandmother was a pretty incredible woman. She was born in a small town in rural Mexico. And she was only educated till 3rd grade, because at 4th grade, you'd have to go to a different town next door. And as she always told me growing up, her mom was too worried that some man was going to steal her away because she was too beautiful. And when she moved to the United States when she was 15, she eventually found a husband, got married, had children, living a happy life. But in her late 20s, her husband, my grandfather, was tragically killed in San Francisco, leaving her with 4 children to raise, the youngest of them being my mother and my mom's twin sister, who were only 2 at the time. And she never remarried and raised pretty incredible children and I would say halfway decent grandchildren. But at the age of 52, she was forced to retire from her job because she was deemed incapable of working because of the rheumatoid arthritis that destroyed her joints. And for the rest of her life, she suffered many illnesses until her eventual death at 71. And I bring this all up because my grandmother and I were very close. And I always remember one day, probably about a year before she passed away, she said something that caused me to pause. She said it in Spanish, but I'll say it in English tonight, don't worry. But we were sitting there on her couch in her tiny apartment, and she said, "Mijo, I often pray that God would take the pain away. I said, I suffered enough, but if this is the cross He gives me, God who loves me, I accept it, and because I trust what He wants." So I pray that today these words, that this great trust in God may increase inside the hearts of all the faithful, and that we too may pray that if this is the cross You give me, You who love me, I accept it because I trust what You want.